Black Hearts in Battersea by Joan Aiken, Chapter 13. "Bless me," said the Duke. "You mean there was nothing left at all?" He stepped into the charcoal burner's hut. The door was half off its hinges. Inside, the place was bare, as the man had said, completely ransacked. "But what about the little girl's bracelet, eh? Have you noticed a small bracelet anywhere, my man?" "No, sir. Mostly the thieves will have taken it. Most likely the thieves will have taken it," said young Turveydrop gloomily, but Sophie noticed him dart a sharp glance around the log walls as if looking for possible hiding places. "I believe—" she began, then checked herself. "Hark! What was that sound?" exclaimed the Duke. Sophie turned her head, listening, then became very pale. Young Turveydrop rushed to the door. The Duke, following him, saw him dart across the clearing to where the open carriage stood, with the driver still in the box. "Mizzle, you fool! Don't you know what that is?" Turveydrop shouted at him, and threw himself onto one of the two carriage horses, slashing the traces with a knife. In a moment he had galloped off down the track. An instant later the driver had followed him on the other horse. "Hey! Come back! Stop!" shouted the Duke. "Good gracious, what very extraordinary behaviour! Sophie, what can be the meaning of it? Why have they taken our horses?" Sophie cast a desperate glance around the open clearing. It was in a coign of the valley. On three sides the forest climbed steeply up at an almost perpendicular slope. The fourth side, from which the baleful cry proceeded, was the way they had come. "Sophie, child, why are you looking so anxious? What is the matter?" "It's wolves, ma'am, coming this way. We must make refuge in the hut until they are gone by," Sophie said, trying to maintain a calm voice and appearance. "Wolves! But oh, those craven wretches!" exclaimed the Duchess. "'Pon my soul! Have the men just made off and left us in the lurch? I shall write to the Times about this." "Please, ma'am, your Grace, please go into the hut." Sophie was almost dancing with impatience. She practically pushed their Graces through the narrow doorway. The threatening, eager cry swelled louder and louder. Sophie cast about for a weapon. The driver had gone off with his musket, but luckily some luggage had been fastened at the rear of the carriage. She seized a bunch of croquet mallets and a bag of billiard balls, and, as an afterthought, the Duchess's embroidery. "Sophie, make haste!" the Duchess called anxiously. Sophie ran back to the hut, where the Duke was vainly trying to adjust the broken door. "Infernal thing," he muttered. "Dangles kitty counterwise. Any wolf would nip through the gap." "Have you a notion how to fix it, Sophie, my lass?" "Ah, croquet mallets! That was well thought of. Those should keep the brutes at arm's length." "I think we can block the doorway, your Grace, if your Grace would not object to my using your embroidery once again." No, take it by all means," the Duchess cried distractedly. Sophie quickly folded the massive piece of material into three and hung it over the door-hole, pegging it with slivers of wood into chinks in the log walls. "What about the windows, my child?" "My foster-father made them small and high on purpose," Sophie said. "Ah, here come the wolves. You can hear the patter of their feet on the dead leaves." In spite of her calm and confident manner, Sophie's heart beat frantically at the terrible howling. As the terrible howling swelled around the hut, it seemed like a hurricane of wolves. Soon the hut began to shake as wolves dashed themselves against the wooden walls. Sophie trembled for the precariously fastened tapestry, but the Duke, showing unwonted courage and resource, seized a pair of croquet mallets and stood guard behind it. Sometimes a shaggy head or a pair of glaring eyes appeared at the windows, but the Duchess and Sophie pelted these attackers with a vigorous rain of billiard balls until they dropped back again. Once a corner of the tapestry came loose as a wolf hurled against it, and the front half of its body thrust into the room, with fangs bared and slavering tongue, but the Duke and Duchess fell upon it simultaneously and belabored it with croquet mallets until it retreated yelping, and Sophie, with desperate haste, pegged the curtain back in position. How long the battle continued it would be hard to say. It seemed an eternity to Sophie, an eternity of darting from point to point, hurling a ball at one window, reaching up with a mallet to thrust back an attacker, at another strike, at a paw that had found foothold on the sill. There was never an instant's rest. But at last the wolves, many of them hurt, evidently decided that this quarry was not to be easily captured. The whole pack ran limping off into the forest. Sophie, on tiptoe at the window, saw them disappear down the track the way they had come. For many minutes longer, none of the three in the hut dared to hope that the wolves had gone for good, but they took advantage of the lull to rest. Sophie and the Duke leaned, panting, against the walls, while the Duchess sat plump down on the floor and fanned herself with the instructions for a game of billiards. "Sophie, Sophie," she sighed, "I do not know how it can be, but when we are with you, we always contrive to run into such adventures." "Come, come, Hetty," his Grace said gruffly. "Admit that the lass always rescues us too. It's thanks to Sophie we aren't vanishing down the gullets of 20 wolves at this instant. By Jehoshaphat, my child, you're a well plucked un, and with your wits about you too. You should have been a boy. I'd 1,000 times sooner have you at my side in a pinch than that whey-faced Justin." "Thank you, Your Grace." Sophie curtsied absently, but her expression was worried. She knew they must not remain in the hut for much longer, for the wolves might return, and night was not far distant. Regardless of the Duchess's little shriek of dismay, she put aside a corner of the tapestry and slipped out of the hut. Many billiard balls were lying on the grass round about, and she hastily gathered up as many as would go into her skirt, and passed them in to the Duke. "Now, Your Graces, I'm going to run to the main road for help. So do you pray, peg up the tapestry again, and do not take it down until you hear my call." "But supposing you meet with a wolf, my child?" "I'll make him regret the day he was born," Sophie said, grimly, taking another croquet mallet from the carriage. She picked up her skirts and ran like the wind. She met with no wolves along the path, but to her dismay, as she neared the turnpike, she began to hear a sound of howling and snarling mixed with terrified whinnies. She collected a number of small rocks into her skirt and went on cautiously. Coming around a thicket, she saw that although the main body of the wolf pack had evidently gone elsewhere, 6 stragglers remained and were attacking the baggage coach, which still stood in the road. The coachman and one of the horses was missing. It was plain that he had followed the example of his cowardly companion and made off. The other 3 horses, half mad with fright, were rearing and striking out at the wolves with their hooves. Sophie lost no time coming to their aid. "Shoo, you brutes!" she shouted in a loud, angry voice. "For shame! Leave the poor defenceless horses alone, or it will be the worse for you. Attacking them when they are harnessed up, indeed." And she followed this up with a hail of rocks, several of which, at such close quarters, found their targets and effectually startled and scattered the wolves. Before they could recover, Sophie rushed among them, whirring the croquet mallet around and around, striking first one, then another, until she won her way through to the coach and jumped up to the box. There, to her delight, she found the driver's blunderbuss, which, in his fright, he had forgotten to take. She just charged among the wolves, and this completed their rout entirely. They made off at top speed. Sophie was so much amused at the doleful spectacle they presented as they fled that she burst out laughing, and then applied herself to soothing and making much of the 3 horses, who were sweating and trembling with fear.